So with that, we will go ahead and get started. I'm also going to throw in, since this is such a strange time we're living through, we're going to throw in some COVID considerations. So we'll talk about how there are some ways that we can help prevent the spread of COVID through our gardening practices. I just want to first make sure everyone is aware that COVID-19 is not a foodborne illness. There has been no research showing that it can be transmitted through our food or food packaging. It's a respiratory illness, so it's primarily spread through respiratory droplets, or if you get it on your hands, or if it was on the produce or something and then you touch your face, that's where the issue comes from. So we'll just have a couple of COVID considerations throughout the presentation. So first off, what is produce safety? It is the in-garden practice for growing and harvesting produce for use in our educational activities and school meals in ways that prevent foodborne illness. So why is food safety important in our school gardens? Well, first and foremost is to keep our kids safe. That's our highest concern. We want to make sure that our kids, while they're in the garden and then whenever they eat the produce out of the garden, that it is safe for them to consume and we don't have any kind of illness happen. Produce can be eaten in the schools. So Sarah mentioned that we can be serving this food in our cafeterias. You can have taste testing, just all different kinds of opportunities with produce from our school gardens. The CDC estimates that 48 million people, so that's 1 out of every 6, do contract some kind of foodborne illness each year. 128,000 are hospitalized and 3,000 die. So food safety is really a big issue. And these are only the reported illnesses. So I know several people that have had some kind of foodborne illness that have never even gone to the doctor for it. They just get over it quickly over a weekend or something. So these are just reported cases. And then we also want to think about produce safety because bacteria and viruses like our E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, those are really the big 3 we hear about in the media. Those are not easily washed off of our produce. So it's really best if we just prevent the contamination in the first place, reduce our risk, and then we don't have to worry about it as much. So just to give you some background context, the whole reason that produce safety is kind of in the spotlight now is back in 2011, the Obama administration passed the Food Safety Modernization Act. And this is a federal regulation that encompasses our entire food system. So it's comprised of 7 different rules, and we will be looking at the produce safety rule. And just so that all of our school gardeners understand this too, you are not federally regulated. So this is for larger operations, farms. So you're not going to have anyone coming and doing an inspection on your garden, but we are going to take components from this produce safety rule and apply those best practices to our gardens so that we can avoid food safety issues. So the produce safety rule is made up of good agricultural practices. These are just best management practices that reduce risk of contamination. So we can't ever totally eliminate contamination because we live in the environment. Our gardens are exposed to the elements. So we can just do certain things to help reduce the risk. So what we're going to be talking about for our produce safety in our gardens is about training anyone who will be in the garden. This is huge, and probably the most frequent way that produce is contaminated is by people. But we'll also talk about our water source, our soil amendments, any wildlife and animals that might be getting into the garden, sanitizing our equipment and tools, and then how we handle that produce after it's been harvested. So these are all areas of produce safety and just different ways we need to think produce safety to help reduce that contamination. And then with all of those components, we can build a food safety plan, which is just a written document outlining our protocols. So the first thing I want to talk about with produce safety is our site selection consideration. So I know a lot of school gardens already have, or schools have their gardens in place, but in case you don't, these are some things you want to think about. And then if you already do have your garden established, you can think about these different aspects and how they're affecting your garden. So the first thing we want to look at is land use history. So what was here before? Is this an area that has a historical flooding issue? Was there chemical dumping? Was it an industrial site? So all of these different things can affect just our ability to grow a garden, and then the safety aspects. We also want to think about access to clean water, because water we use all throughout the growing stages. So anywhere from growing to harvesting to cleaning, we're using water. And then we want to look at our surrounding land. So what are the outside factors that are going to influence our food safety? So in this little graphic, we have a school with a garden, and we're just going to kind of pick it apart real quick and see all the different things that could be affected, that could affect our food safety. So you see we have the school and a nice creek running alongside it with some wooded area. So we know we're going to have wildlife living in that area. And then up on the right, we have the suburbs where the kids live. And then we have the power lines, of course. So just some food safety risks. So uphill of the garden, we have the suburbs. So what could be running off down that hill into the garden when it rains? We might have gas, oil, pesticides, herbicides, anything people are spraying. Just think about that running down into your garden. The school has livestock, so they have their own chickens and goats and rabbits, and that's such a fun teaching tool for our kids. But look how close it is to our garden. Is there potential for them to get out of the pen and into the garden? When it rains, could the manure from that area run into our garden? And then that creek, does it ever flood? Could that contaminate the garden? Are we going to have a deer issue with it being that close to the creek? Are we going to have issues with the power lines? Birds like to congregate on power lines. So are we putting our gardens directly under that power line where the birds are going to be pooping right onto our produce? So all of these are different things we have to look at whenever we're trying to choose a spot to establish the garden. So the first thing we want to do before we actually bring our kids into the garden that we've established is health and hygiene training. So first we need to teach them how contamination is even spread. And this is gross, but the main way is feces. So we really need to be conscientious of washing our hands. Just think about all the things you've touched even in the last hour. When's the last time we've cleaned our phones, our computers, doorknobs? So think about all those things you've touched and how you could be spreading contamination if you haven't washed your hands. Our clothing and footwear are also really key ways that we can spread contamination. So if you do have animals on your school grounds, have you been in with the animals? Have you stepped in manure, and now are you tracking that into your garden? Our tools and equipment have direct contact with our produce, so we have to know that we've cleaned those well. And then of course, illness and injury. So we need to have some kind of plan in place if a kid is sick and goes into the garden, or if they injure themselves, we need to have a plan in place for making sure they're okay, but also protecting the produce and having a no harvest plan if it's been contaminated. So a couple of different policies that you might want to have in place for your garden is a food and drink policy. We recommend that you don't allow any food or drink in the garden. Maybe a closed water bottle would be all right, but no eating and drinking in the garden is best practice. Have an emergency plan in place in case a kid does fall and scrape their knee. Get them to the nurse, and then also make sure none of the produce has been contaminated with blood, because we can transmit disease that way. And then having a clothing requirement is really important. So they need to be wearing clean clothes into the garden, and then closed-toed shoes, which is just for their safety, but also to reduce contamination.
He's bringing me some landscape staples.
We also recommend not wearing hand jewelry in the garden, because that is pretty hard to clean. So the produce safety rule
I had to make sure to get mute. I'm working.
Plain wedding bands are okay, because those can be adequately cleaned, but nothing with stones or designs on them. And then another way to just monitor who's been in and out of the garden to make sure there are no issues is having an attendance sheet. So that could be a useful tool in a school setting. For our COVID consideration, as I mentioned earlier, it's a respiratory illness. So make sure that everyone in the garden knows how COVID is spread, as well as our foodborne illness diseases. So make sure that they know to sneeze or cough into their elbow and to wash their hands frequently, especially before coming into the garden. So speaking of hand washing, I'm sure we've all heard this several times since we've been in this pandemic, but here's how we want our kids to wash their hands. So wet your hands with water, apply soap and lather, and scrub for at least 20 seconds. So to make it fun for the kids, they can sing through the ABCs or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star 2 times, and that's about 20 seconds. Then we rinse our hands with clean water, dry them with a paper towel, and then use that paper towel to turn off the faucet. We don't want to be grabbing the faucet with our clean hands to turn it off when we turned it on with dirty hands. And then throw away that paper towel into a trash can. Never use reusable towels, because then you can just spread contamination through the reusable towel. And this is critical to know, antibacterial hand sanitizers cannot replace hand washing. You cannot sanitize a dirty surface, so that hand washing always needs to come first. So now we're going to talk a little about soil amendments. So this is really important because if you even want to grow a garden, you need to know what's in your soil. So the best way to figure out what's in your soil is by having a soil analysis done. You can contact your local county extension office, and the state of Arkansas actually has free soil analysis. So you can just send in a soil sample and they'll send you the results of what's in it for free. But if your county extension agent can't come out and do the analysis or the sampling for you in the time frame you need, you can take the samples yourself. It's super simple. All you need is either a spade, or a lot of offices have a soil probe that you can borrow, and it'll help you take a 4-inch deep sample. Take as many samples as you need to get kind of a representative sample of the whole area and mix that together to fill a pint box. But if you have a really large space, the recommended amount of soil samples is 20 to 25 soil cores per acre. So keep that in mind. You're just trying to get a representative sample of the garden you're working in. And then you will have enough soil to fill a pint box, and then you can just drop that off with your county extension agent and they will get it mailed in for you. So once you have your soil test results, you have to decide what amendments you need to add. Do you need to be adding nutrients? Do you need to adjust your pH? So this brings up the question of what kind of garden do we want this to be? Do we want it to be a conventional garden? Do we want to practice organic practices? So you have to make those decisions for your garden. And then compost. This is an excellent soil amendment, but it also brings in a whole host of risks. So just think through those whenever you're making your plans. Are you going to have pathogen risks with your soil amendments? Are you going to attract animals? The smell of compost as it's composting can be an animal attractant. Are you going to have a runoff issue into your garden, and then cross-contamination from your soil amendments? So compost, I mentioned, has a lot of risks with it, but it also has tons of benefits. We really like compost for how it improves our soil. And it's also a method to reduce waste. So you could actually compost at your school. You could take the scraps from the cafeteria and from your garden and any yard trimmings and turn that waste into compost. So it's a great teaching tool for our kids, but it also improves our soil by adding nutrients back into the soil. It improves the soil structure, and it improves our water holding capacity, which in turn helps us save water by not having to water our gardens as frequently. So there's tons of benefits with compost. Now, if you want to compost on your school property, you then have to decide, do I want it to be a vegetative origin or a biological origin? So if you have animals, you might want to use the manure out of your animal pens. That could be a great source of nutrients. Or you might want to just keep it with the vegetative yard trimmings and cafeteria scraps. Both have different risks associated with them. But either way, you need to be using a scientifically validated method of composting. So you can see in this picture, there is a temperature probe in the compost pile. You need to have the temperature of your compost pile at 130 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days. It naturally heats up as the composting process is occurring from microbial activity during that composting process. So this is killing the bacteria and also weed seeds, so you won't have weed issues whenever you apply this to your garden. And then you need to think about the application and storage of your compost. So make sure you're storing your compost in a location away from the garden and so that it's covered and not attracting animals. And then the National Organic Program recommends that compost be applied 120 days before harvest. This is to reduce that contamination risk. So being exposed to UV rays and just that time allows things to die off. In case something didn't die in the composting process, you're reducing your risk of contaminating your produce. And just be sure that the compost does not come into contact with the harvestable portion of edibles. But really the best practice for school gardens would to not use school-made compost in our school gardens in a produce garden. If you have a pollinator garden or ornamentals, this would be a great place to use your school compost. But if you do want to use it in your produce garden, just be sure to abide by that 120-day rule. And then our extension website has a great page on composting. I have the link here, so be sure to check that out if you have any questions on composting. Tons of resources are on that site. We also need to know our water source because water affects almost every stage of gardening. So what are the risks with water? Well, they can carry and spread human pathogens. So they have the potential to contaminate the entire garden. So if your water source is contaminated and you go and water with a water hose and spray water everywhere, now everything's contaminated. And like I said, it's used in all the phases of gardening. Cleaning our tools and equipment, washing our hands, irrigation, and then washing the produce after it's been picked. So we really need to make sure our water source is clean. There are 3 different water sources. We have our surface water, which is the most risky. Those are things like ponds, rivers, any kind of collected water that's exposed to the elements. That's our surface water. And then we have groundwater, so we're pumping from a well. And then we have our municipal water, which is the safest. So the best practices with water is to either use that municipal water or groundwater. If you're using groundwater, we recommend that you have that water tested. The Department of Health can do that test, and they will tell you if there is either the presence or absence of E. coli in your water. And if you come back and have a presence, you need to treat your well water and then have it tested again until you have an absence of E. coli. And then the best way to apply water to our produce gardens is through drip irrigation. So in this picture, you can see in that front bed, those 2 black hoses that are laying in the soil. That's our drip irrigation. It's just got a bunch of little holes in it, and the water, it's very low pressure, just drips right into the soil, doesn't splash onto the plants. So just remember, less plant contact is a less chance of contamination. So what about harvesting water? This is another great teaching tool. It can teach our kids how to use their resources, but it's also super risky for produce gardening. So best practice for our harvested rainwater is to just use it on our ornamental plants or our pollinator garden, and to never allow it to touch the edible parts of our plants that we will be harvesting. So as a rule of thumb, if you wouldn't drink this water, you probably shouldn't be using it in your produce garden. Animal management. This is a really tricky one. So animals can carry and transmit human diseases. So we have to be really careful with our school animals if we have those, and then also wild animals can be coming in our garden. So a lot of schools are starting to have rabbits, chickens, and goats. This is a picture of Dr. Perez, the food safety specialist for extension at Dunbar Garden, who has chickens and goats. So maybe best practice for this, it would be to alternate what days the kids are working with the animals and then going into the garden. So have those on different days. Or if you could do this, have it scheduled to where they're in the garden first and then go deal with the animals afterwards. That way we're not allowing for the chance of the kids tracking in manure or not washing their hands after they've handled the animals. And then for wild animals, this one's a lot harder to control because we have birds flying over, and then squirrels, raccoons, deer, all of those are attracted to our produce. Even cats can be an issue coming into the garden. So the best way to manage for this is to just look for signs of animal intrusion. Look to see if there has been feeding on any of your plants. Look for feces and tracks, and just know if you've had animals in the garden, and then if anything's been contaminated, you need to flag that off and not harvest that contaminated produce. So animals can also contaminate our water source. That's another reason we really don't like surface water. And then also think about that manure runoff. Is it contaminating your crop? So tips to keep animals out of the garden. There's a couple of different things we can do that kind of help. Nothing's perfect, but these will help with keeping some of our animals out. So of course, keep our school animals separate, but we can also install fencing around our school garden. There's the tall 8-foot fences that hopefully will help keep deer and other animals out. But Extension recommends a 3D electric fence for deer. I'm not sure if you really want an electric fence on a school property, but you could look into this if it might be a good option. But this 3D fence, which you can see in this top picture, has 2 different levels of electric fencing, and that messes with the deer's depth perception to where they aren't sure how far to jump to get over it, so they don't even try. Plus the electric shock helps condition them. So this has been really practical. Maybe this would be more practical for a community garden if you have signs posted rather than in a school setting. You can also make your land less desirable to animals by trimming back trees. If you do have birds coming into the garden and eating your produce or berries, whatever you have, netting might be a good option. And then just be aware of where your compost is, because again, that can attract animals. And then of course, train your students and anyone else who's in the garden to look for signs of animal contamination and to let the teacher know if they see anything. And again, never harvest that produce that has been contaminated, because like I said at the beginning, once the produce has been contaminated, it's really hard to wash it clean. So once you do harvest your produce, you need to think about your sanitation program. So any unclean surface can harbor those pathogens and contaminate our produce. So we want to make sure we have clean harvest tools like our buckets or harvest knives or scissors. We want to make sure that tables where we put our produce after it's picked are clean. And we want to keep the surrounding area clean. So make sure that if you have like a potting shed or something where you keep your harvest tools, make sure that the grass is trimmed around it so that mice and other rodents aren't tempted to be over in that area. And we also want to make sure we don't have standing water anywhere, because Listeria in particular likes standing water. So we want to make sure we're avoiding that. And our COVID consideration for this is that COVID-19 can live up to 72 hours on certain surfaces, like stainless steel. So we really want to be sure to regularly clean and sanitize all of our surfaces that produce comes into contact with. So make sure your tools are clean. Establish a regular cleaning and sanitization plan for tools, tables, and other contact surfaces. Avoid setting your harvest equipment on the ground, because again, you could be picking up something and not even know it and contaminating your produce. And then always use potable or municipal water to clean your tools. So what is the difference between cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting? We're hearing a lot about this right now. So cleaning, you're physically removing the dirt and debris off of a surface. Sometimes it's with detergent and water, sometimes you can dry clean. Sanitizing reduces the number of germs to a safe level on a clean surface within 1 minute. This is what we do with produce safety. We always recommend cleaning and sanitizing. And then disinfecting destroys or inactivates all infectious organisms on a clean, non-porous surface within 10 minutes. So with COVID-19, they're really stressing that we need to be disinfecting surfaces. And remember, you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. Cleaning will always come first, whether you're sanitizing or disinfecting. So that's our basic overview of produce safety. And I just wanted to share a little activity that you can do with your kids to teach them about produce safety and help them think about it before they're in the garden. So my friend Taylor Starkey, who is a garden teacher at the Delta School in Wilson, actually came up with this little activity for her kids after she went through produce safety training. So what she did was she divided her students up into small groups and had them create their own garden layouts, thinking about produce safety. So she let them totally pick what they were gonna do. They got to pick what produce they wanted to grow, if they wanted to have animals, if they wanted to compost, and then how they wanted to irrigate. So all the different aspects of gardening. And then after they had that in place, they had to go through and look at all the food safety risks. So I put together a quick little demonstration. This is the elementary school I went to in Fayetteville. It's Root Elementary. And back when I was there, they did not have a school garden, but now they've put in a really tiny raised bed garden. You can see it here on the right side of this picture. It's by their gym. So the school's on the left and there's a walkway over to the gym that goes by the garden. So for my garden that I'm going to do, I'm gonna expand it out, put more raised beds in, and I'm gonna grow tomatoes, carrots, strawberries, and zucchini. So there's my garden there. I don't want to have animals because there's just not the space. I am going to compost and I'm going to put it on this side of the gym, kind of down towards the bottom of the screen. We're going to compost just scraps from the cafeteria, so it's not of animal origin. And then I'm using city water, and there is a faucet over on that side of the gym. I'm just going to run drip irrigation out to my garden. So now I'm going to look at risks. So my produce is grown in raised beds, but it's easily accessible by anyone. So it goes right by the pathway to the gym, and then there's a sidewalk that lots of people walk down. So that might be a food safety issue that anyone can get in there. Animals are an issue. There's lots of deer in the area, even though it's in the middle of town. And then there's power lines lining that sidewalk. So I wanna make sure to think about that when I put my garden in. And then my compost could attract animals too. But my water, again, very little risk, it's municipal water. So then my risk management would be to install a fence around my garden to help keep people and deer out. And maybe I'll post some signs saying, anyone entering the garden must be accompanied by the garden teacher, something like that. And then for my animals, my fencing should help. And I'm not going to plant directly under the power lines. And I'm also going to put in a scarecrow, which those are not super effective in deterring wildlife, but it would be a fun project for the kids to build a scarecrow and put it out there. And then for my compost, I'm going to make sure it's in a securely closed container and away from my garden, so that if it does for some reason attract animals, it's not directly next to my garden. And for my water, even though it's very clean city water, I'm still going to use drip irrigation. So that's just a fun activity. They can do a little presentation and maybe draw the garden, have some kind of creative aspect to it. So that's just an idea if you wanted to do that with your kids. So this is my team with the local, regional, and food safety team at the Extension Service. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Angela Gardner, Rick Weaver, both work in produce safety with me. And then Amanda Filia Perez is the food safety specialist for Extension. And Lisa Brown is our administrative assistant who keeps us all in line. Thank you for listening. Here's my contact information. Again, feel free to reach out by email or phone. You can go to our website, which is uaex.edu/local-foods. And we also have a link from there to our produce safety site. And we are also on Facebook, so be sure to follow us for all things local foods and food safety. And with that, I'll stop share and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that great overview of produce safety. I've taken one of the produce safety classes, and it's a whole day experience, and I love how tailored down you made that. It's really specific to school gardens, so thank you. I know that there was some great thoughts that came through when you were in the middle of talking about composting, Julia. Catherine Quinn talked about that if you get food scraps from the cafeteria, students need to separate the meat and plastic waste out of their compost bucket. And then Alexandra also talked about using the Bokashi method for composting meat and dairy. So I just wanted to throw that out there since you were speaking when that happened. But let's open it up. If other people have questions or comments or experiences of food safety in a school garden, we would love to hear it. We have about 14 minutes or so to just sort of have that discussion. I'd love for us to just kind of open it up. If you've worked in a school garden and thought about food safety, we'd love to hear your experience from a few people. And if there's any other tricks of the trade that you might have that Julia didn't touch on, I think those would be really great to share right now.
Hey, Sarah, Julia, this is Laura Warren with the County Extension Service in Little Rock. I've started using a bucket of soapy water in the garden, and I'd like your opinion on it. We just wash our hands as we're leaving. I mean, it's really like the lowest level. When we're going back to the classroom, the kids will go inside, then they'll go to the bathroom and have their bathroom break. But what are your thoughts on bucket of water, soapy water for the garden? Should I be doing it on their way into the garden?
Yeah, they really need to wash their hands before they go into the garden. So are they just like dipping their hands in the bucket of soapy water as they leave? Or what are they doing exactly?
Well, typically, the children are in charge of all the garden management and maintenance. And they are weeding and planting and digging and thinning. So any activity in the garden, they're responsible for it. So they periodically get pretty muddy. And, I'm trying to be a good school partner with my school and not track in a bunch of mess that the custodians have to clean up. So they're just stopping off at the bucket, and then we dump it after every class. And it's just to get them a little bit tidier on the way out.
Okay, yeah, for on the way out, I think that's fine. But for going into the garden, they need to be washing their hands. Just if they didn't wash their hands after they went to the bathroom or touched something dirty, they need to not be bringing that into the garden and contaminating the produce. And there are some really simple hand washing stations that you can build really cheaply, like $15 to $30, that could be really practical for a school garden. I will try to find the link real quick and throw it in the chat, but I think it was University of Minnesota has a plan for that. And it's just like a gallon or a 5-gallon jug that you can turn off and on, and then have a little soap container and paper towels, and just have them wash their hands before they enter the garden. And then for trying to be cleaner going back into the school, I think the soapy bucket of water could work. It's just not probably adequately cleaning to reduce that microbial contamination.
Great response, Julia. I would also echo what Laura Warren was saying. It's so thoughtful of Laura, for you to be thinking on, as kids are dirty and coming back into the school, how can you help reduce some of that? So I think it's a great solution, and maybe just letting teachers know that they should still encourage their students in their class to still wash their hands after they've left the garden, but you're taking off a lot of the bulk dirt that they might have in contamination. That could be really great. Julia, we've had a lot of great comments coming in our chat here, so I'm going to read off the best I can. Okay, question. Last week, I took some compost from our school compost bin and put it in a raised bed. The next day, I put tomatoes and flowers in it. Will it be okay?
Okay, so say that one more time. You had compost.
It was in the school compost bin, put it in a raised bed. Then the next day, put tomatoes and flowers in it.
Oh, yeah. So you planted your plants. You're not going to harvest those for a while. So I don't know if I made that clear. The 120 days that the National Organic Program recommends is before harvest. So you want that 120 days of sun exposure and all of that to help reduce the contamination. So they should be fine.
Thanks, Julia.
And also, real quick, Rip, would you mind finding the link to how to build a hand washing station from University of Minnesota and putting that in the chat? I'm not multitasking well.
Thanks,
It's not
Julia.
that easy, I can tell you. I'll look for it.
Thanks, Rip.
Okay, another question from Monica says, are there grants available to get school gardens started? Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. One, the School Garden of the Year, Arkansas Grown School Garden of the Year contest is opening on May 11th. So that's a contest where you can apply and be recognized and get funding for your school garden. There are categories based on startup gardens, and then the other ones include like community collaboration, education, harvesting, and an overall school garden winner. So that's one way. At the Arkansas Department of Agriculture, we're looking into other school garden grants and hoping that some will come out the pipeline pretty soon and down the line. Farm Bureau also provides a lot of garden grants. Some of my other garden friends, feel free to jump on. Lowe's has some garden grants. Whole Kids Foundation. Game and Fish, I think, has a $250 grant as well. Yes, there are so many out there. If you are having a hard time finding funding, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to help find some grants for you. Okay. Catherine Quinn asked, what would be a standard washing procedure for lettuce greens to be served in the cafeteria? Julia.
I think typically for lettuce, it's harvested and then put into like a 3-wash system. So you would just rinse all the dirt off and then put it, you can use a sanitizer if you want. So water and sanitizer, you would read the label of it's a food grade sanitizer to mix it properly, and then your lettuce would go into that, and then you would do a final just clean water rinse. I think that's typically how lettuce is washed.
What about rain barrels not being appropriate for watering the garden? Julia, can you go back to that one?
Yes, so I think it's a great idea in theory, but if you think about all the things that could be in that collected water, so a lot of times you're getting roof runoff. So what's been on the roof? Probably squirrels, birds have flown over it. So there's a really high chance that there's E. coli and salmonella in that water. So I would not use that on produce, but if you have a pollinator garden or ornamentals, that's a great way to use that water.
We had someone pop on and say that Catherine Quinn had recommends always doing harvesting first with kids, because that's when their hands are going to be the cleanest, and then maybe having them do any weeding or dirt work. So I think that's a great suggestion. Do we need to discourage students from eating produce right off the plant, like cherry tomatoes and blueberries?
That's kind of up to whoever is in charge. So like I said at the very beginning of that presentation, if it's contaminated with E. coli, salmonella, whatever the foodborne microbe or the disease is, so it's really hard to wash off once it's on there. So if it's contaminated, you're probably not going to get it to wash off anyway. That's why we're trying to avoid contaminating in the first place. So if they eat directly out of the garden, odds are they're okay. I don't know, that's up to the teacher and I guess what risk you're willing to take. But there's no rule in the produce safety rule, there's no regulation on eating directly out of the garden. There's nothing in there about you have to wash it first.
Thanks, Julia. I know that I've seen kids like pull a carrot out with dirt on it and just go at it. So there's only so much we can do as teacher educators.
Building the immune system.
I even catch myself sometimes. So sorry, what were you saying, Julia?
It's building your immune system up, right?
Yeah, it's preparing us. All right, we got a couple of questions here. Are there any standard operating procedures or checklists that we recommend for kids? Do you keep records of who's in the garden? What about recommended harvesting containers?
I don't know of any SOPs for school gardens. I have a farm food safety template that the Southern University came up with to help our farmers think through food safety and protocols and all of that I can share with Sarah to send out later. But that might be a good question for people who already have school gardens and have done this, if they have any kind of protocols that they follow. And then as far as harvest containers go, We recommend using plastic because wood is very hard to clean and sanitize just because it's porous. So if you have a hard plastic bucket, I think that's the easiest to clean and sanitize for produce safety.
This is a great question too, and I wonder if there's interest. I think that, you know, Julia and I could work on the SOP that you were talking about, Julia, and how we might want to tweak it slightly for school gardens. We could work on something like that probably, if that would be of interest to a lot of you. Just let us know. Sounds like you guys want a list of garden grants, so I'll be sure to include it in the follow-up email. I'll list out as many as I can and try to pull the links for that as well. And I saw that John McMinn added the Arkansas Farm Bureau grants as well. Don't remember if I said that, so thank you, John, for putting those in there. And then Rip added in here the hand washing station that Julia was talking about. So that link's in here as well, where you can see
Is that the right one, Julia?
I don't know, I haven't had a chance to.
Oh yeah, it's from Minnesota, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Those are great ones, let me say.
That was the link, Rip. So that's a really easy method to build your own hand washing station.
Checking through to make sure there wasn't anything else we missed. Yeah, I think we got all your questions in the chat. You know, we got a couple minutes. Feel free, if you have some more, to throw them in the chat, or feel like if you want to unmute yourself. But I want to say thanks so much to Julia for that great presentation, and to all of you for that great questions that came in. Yes, I love Rip, giving her a round of applause. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.